Good morning, friends. How nice to be with you again. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Guide us that we may feel your presence. Help us to lift our consciousness above the ever-changing human drama, that we may live in this world in constant remembrance of our true home with Thee. Om, peace. Amen. We've been going through the part of the writing called A New Dispensation, and we've been talking about all members of the family of self-realization reflect in their lives qualities particular to this ray. Joy, openness, trust. We've talked about all of those. And the last one he calls a certain inner radiance, which is a little bit hard to quantify, isn't it? But it's a beautiful aspect of being a devotee. It's exactly what we're called these satsangs. It's called living in the light. When I was wanting to shift over from calling this, first we started calling these satsangs shelter in place. That got rather old. We had another one, the fireside chats. That's what we were calling it also. And I was just trying hard to think about what would be an appropriate way to describe what we're doing here, 4 days a week talking together. And it was very simply living in the light. That's what we're trying to do. Because we are compelled to live in this world. We are compelled to live with one another. We are subject to the karma of our country and our region and our city and our culture. All of these things are forced upon us by our karma, but nonetheless, we do not feel that we have an option. An option is not accessible to us. So outer circumstances are often seemingly beyond our control. But the company we keep inwardly is what we have control over. So what we're trying to do wherever we are and whatever we're doing is to live in the light instead of allow circumstances to create a shadow. I mean, Master writes about in the poem Samadhi, he talks about vanish the veils of light and shade, which I have always found very significant. He doesn't say light and darkness, which is the obvious parallel that you usually make. But shade or shadow is created when something comes between you and the light. The light is unchanged, but something has obscured your capacity to be in it. And so the inner radiance that Swamiji is talking about is this constant keeping the company of God and Guru. And when we solve every problem, when we recognize that our primary responsibility is to shift our consciousness, and no matter what comes to us, we keep turning our attention toward that light, we develop a certain inner radiance. And that's just the only way to call it. And so when we're in tune with this path, it shows. There's an irony of community life that I myself have both observed and been on the receiving end of it. Sometimes I'll see someone and they'll just look particularly wonderful to me. And I'll say, my goodness, you look well. And very often that person is going through a hard time. But because they're going through a hard time, they're reaching with even greater determination to live in the light because there is a strong shadow force trying to take them out of it. Of course, it's not always true. Sometimes when we're going through a hard time, we look terrible. But it's surprising how often people will say how good you look when you actually don't feel well at all. Because that inner radiance is the fire of aspiration for God that's burning within us, and the response that comes from the Master when that call goes forth. It's also interesting, Swami, at the very beginning of this section, when some days ago when I was reading it, when he talked about that bright disciple of Master who decided to leave Master and go to another guru, and Master said, "All right then, I withdraw my ray." And Swamiji said, and then when we saw her later, the light that had been in her was gone. She looked like a very ordinary person at that point. So it's also not what we generate from within ourselves, but what we magnetize to ourselves by our profound and deep call to God to rescue us. So moving on, Swami now starts a section he calls the present ray. Into this country, he's writing from the US, into this country, and at this particular time in history, God has sent a powerful ray of his light. And he's speaking of Master coming to America. To see this ray only in terms of Paramahansa Yogananda's personal life and teachings would be to misunderstand the true greatness of his mission. Swamiji, as if to contradict me, I said he's speaking of Masters coming to this world. Well, he is talking about that historical event. But he's saying to define this ray only as Master coming here and teaching, he said, would be to misunderstand the true greatness of his mission. The disciples of Jesus, similarly, have done him a disservice in too much personalizing his mission. The secret of Yogananda's greatness lay in the clarity of his transmission of a new ray of light from the divine. As many as receive it, and in proportion as they receive it, to them, as he told his students, will be given the power to become the sons of God. So it's a divine mystery that's hard to solve with the human mind, and we just have to live with it and gradually grow in comfort to understand this. Master put onto the altar images of each of these 5 masters, including his own picture. There's a drawing of Babaji that Master himself helped his brother create. There's a painting of Jesus, because of course from experience pictures are available. Much of the time there was a painting by an artist named Hoffman. In the last few years, there was a painting taken from the Shroud of Turin, which is said to be an actual impression of of Jesus's face. And there was a painting made of Jesus from that shroud, which Swamiji was very magnetized to, and many of us really liked. So some of the Ananda altars, including in Palo Alto, now have that picture instead of the Hoffman painting. There is an actual photograph of Lahiri Mahashaya, although some self-realization churches use a painting from that photograph because the painting is crisper, but the photograph is the actual photograph, and that's what we prefer to use, of Lahiri Mahashaya, and then a photograph of Sri Yukteswar and a photograph of Yogananda. Imagine if we had a photograph of Jesus, how much we would like to have that. So Master puts these specific individual faces onto the altar of specific human beings. As it happened, they were all in male bodies. These specific human beings who are the avatars and masters of our path. And at the same time, we have to understand that those specific faces and those specific incarnations are windows into the infinite, that our devotion is not actually to that individual as an individual, but to the clarity of the ability of that individual to transmit the pure power of God. So we are always bouncing in our devotion between the the heart opening that is inspired by having a point of focus for our devotion, and then how that point of focus actually leads us into a world that far transcends them. So the way Swami puts it is to limit our understanding of what Master's mission is to him is to completely misunderstand. But to ignore the channel through which the blessing comes to us is both unwise and ungrateful. And God plays it out with us. We have a specific guru, we have specific teachers, we have great disciples who guide us. Throughout my spiritual life, I've always been guided and inspired by Swami Kriyananda. I still am. And he led me to devotion to Yogananda, but I would never have had the devotion to Yogananda without also having the experience of Swami Kriyananda. And through all of that, I come to an understanding of my relationship to God and to Divine Mother. It can't be parsed apart with the mind. But what Swami is trying to do in this entire piece of writing that he's given to us is to help us to pick this up from the right string in the right way for the sake of our salvation. So then we have also this quote from the Bible, which is often quoted, "To all those who received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God." But then Swami puts an extra phrase in there, because we receive God in exact portion according to how much room we've made for God in our hearts. This is an image that is not, it doesn't hold up to really careful metaphysical scrutiny, but nonetheless it gives us an idea. Our heart is full of many desires, likes and dislikes and disappointments and hopes and longings, and just all of the cacophony of all the different vrittis that are competing for our attention and our life force. And into that same heart, we want to magnetize the power and the presence of God. And according to our ability to draw it, and according to our ability to receive it, which is not absolute. It's not like the door is either open or shut, and it's not as if the vessel is either empty or full. It's that we receive God in as much as we are able to receive him. And in proportion to how much we are able to receive him, he then gives us power. So sometimes in Christianity, in the fundamentalist view of it, it's like you're damned and then you're saved. And it's like it's all either you are or you're not. In the teaching of self-realization, it's more consistent with human experience, which is we are somewhat committed, we are somewhat open. We may be profoundly and deeply sincere in the moments when we are open, but sometimes those moments are short-lived, or something interferes with it, another ray of something comes through, and then all of a sudden we're preoccupied with other realities, and we're not who we want to be. So Swamiji is making a very important point. To all who received him, in proportion to their ability to receive him, they receive power. And this is one of the things about the path of self-realization, is that it's progressive and it's directional. I mean, there is an absolute state that we will eventually come to, but along the way, as Swamiji says, it's not like walking through a barren desert and then suddenly being in the oasis. It's rather that as we walk, the desert begins to bloom around us. So in proportion to how much we receive God, we experience that inner radiance and we live in the light. And then something shadows it. And then we move out from the shadow again. And this, over many lifetimes, we gradually become free. So then he goes on to say, he says a new section. So first he speaks of the present ray and was wanting us to broaden our understanding beyond the presence of Master himself. And this section now is called When the Disciple is Ready. And he says, what causes a divine ray to shine down from time to time onto this dark planet? That's a good question, isn't it? Why did Master come? Yogananda's answer to that was, God chooses those who choose him. So the divine light is always shining. It's a question of whether or not we turn toward it. Master also said, God replies to us in proportion to the intensity of our call to him. So this is what we were saying a few minutes ago, that God is always there, but he responds to us. That's what is hard to understand. He's responding to us. And he's not responding to what the superficial impression we might try to put on for the world. He's responding to what is truly and deeply in our hearts. Any individual who calls earnestly enough will receive a divine response. That cosmic river of consciousness, which bears the healing waters of grace, will direct a portion of its flow toward earth. So the divine is always there, and when we call to God earnestly, his grace will come to us. Sometimes people think that God isn't answering our prayers because he's not responding in what we would define as an answer. And so sometimes we have to just go forward. In fact, in his Whispers from Eternity, at the beginning of that book, Master gives a certain amount of instruction for how to use these prayers. And one of the things he talks about is how you pray with a certain amount of intensity and a certain amount of commitment. And then you have to go forward in faith that God has heard your prayer and that he will answer. And he said then and Master even goes farther, put it out of your mind. He said, if you've prayed sincerely, God has heard you. But how he's going to respond to you is not up to us to determine. And Swami and Master say here, when you pray sincerely, God will send his grace. How and when is where the endurance of the devotee comes in. Then Swami says, but no man, as the poet John Donne put it, is an island. We are linked with the consciousness of all mankind. What John Donne was talking about, I mean, it's a poetic reference, no man is an island. It looks on the surface, if you're looking at the ocean, you may see a landmass that rises above the water, and it looks to be just free floating, having no relationship to anything else. But if you go deep enough or go wide enough, you find that hidden from view, everything is interconnected. And so we as human beings live in this world with this feeling of being separate from one another. But that's an illusion created by Maya, created by the limitations of human consciousness to perceive reality. And in this same way, we are linked to the consciousness of all mankind. When the general consciousness is low, if the yuga on the planet is low, it is difficult for any individual to rise. The great German poet-scientist Goethe, perhaps the greatest mind of his age, attributed most of his genius to the contribution of other minds. He was able to build upon what other men had already, the groundwork laid by others, and then from that to attain heights that wouldn't have been possible if he hadn't been in context. It's also a mark of his genius, which is characterized by humility, that instead of claiming the power for his own, he gave the credit to all who came before. No one can rise far above what others before him have already achieved. Thus, when one solitary soul cries out for God, the response, in proportion to the intensity of the call, will not be so great as when a whole community, a whole people call. The spirituality of the one will be diluted, if only somewhat, by the worldliness of the whole. And what Swami's coming to here is he's talking about these great masters come not just because one person calls to them, but because there's a whole flow of consciousness happening among a group of people who, over time, actually have formed themselves into great spiritual families. And our incarnational experiences are not solitary. It's not like one solitary person, lands here or lands there. It's over the course of time. Swami writes about this really beautifully in The Path. In his autobiography, he describes toward the end about how over many lifetimes we form these long, deep relationships with other human beings, and we tend to be both in the astral and in the physical world in the company of what over time becomes a very large spiritual family. And that spiritual family working together, helping each other, creates a magnetic field that helps everyone to be stronger on the path. I mean, just think of it in strictly practical terms. If you were the only person in your entire village who is thinking about the path of self-realization, about meditation, about attunement to God, about self-realization, you're the only person practicing Kriya, you're the only person practicing energization exercises, it's much harder to hold to what you're doing when you say to your family, I need to meditate for an hour this morning, so I'm not going to come to breakfast until 9. Oh, we all want to have breakfast at 8. Why do you need to keep doing that? Come and sit and watch television with us, have a beer, go to the pub, whatever it might be. If everybody around you is pulling in that direction, it's very hard. It's much harder. But if you live, and this is why Master suggested that we make these small communities of like-minded souls, if you live in a village of people who share your aspiration, you help each other on a continuous basis. And Swami's also describing that these groups of people also create a divine magnetism together. Their shared aspiration, their shared worship, their shared celebration, their shared liturgy literally creates a magnetic field that in proportion draws more of divine grace to us, which is why many of us, really cling to the idea of satsang, which is company of fellow truth seekers, because it's easier to hold our magnetic field strong when we're with others who are aspiring in the same way. It's common sense. So Swami says in this also, thus when one solitary soul cries out for God, the response, in proportion to the intensity of the call, will not be so great as when a whole community, a whole people call. The spirituality of the one will be diluted, if only somewhat, by the worldliness of the whole. Yogananda wrote in his interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita that from time to time, in the great storm of Maya, which is this created world that we live in, which is restlessly and continuously affirming to us that matter is the only reality and self-aggrandizement is the only way to happiness. In this great storm of Maya or delusion, an area of calm appears. There it is much easier for souls to escape delusion and find God. He was referring to the same phenomenon. When enough people call sincerely enough, a mighty flow from the river of grace is deflected toward this planet. A new ray of light is drawn downward, and all who tune into it are uplifted as they never could be, were they to struggle merely on their own. So Master used the word a new dispensation, but he also used the word a special dispensation. I said to Swamiji when I first heard that, Sir, does that mean that people actually receive more than they've earned in some way? And Swami says, I know that sounds, contrary to the fundamental laws of karma. He said, but yes, that is exactly what Master said. And it's then the good karma of those who are part of that flow of energy. So every so often in this sea of Maya, an area of calm appears. And what that means is an area of calm is not like the material world isn't happening, but there's a vibrational power there that in the midst of ordinary life, There's this extra strong force. I mean, you can feel it in holy places. I've been to Jerusalem. I've been in the Holy Sepulchre. It's not like any other place you've ever been. I've been to Ananda Village. I've been to Swami Kriyananda's apartment at Ananda Village. I've been to Master's room at Mount Washington. It's just the material world. I mean, it's a physical place that a human body walks into. But there's a power there that is uncommon. And what Master's saying is that every so often for purposes known only to God, these power moments are created. And of course, where Swami's going is the descent of these masters to this world at this time have created a vibrational power reality. It's manifested in physical places where devotees of this line congregate. But it's not a physical phenomenon. It's a divine phenomenon. And this happens because, for one, it's the shifting of the age. We're moving from Kali Yuga into Dwapara, and a tremendous amount of energy is needed to make this happen. And souls, members of this spiritual family and other related spiritual families, of which there are many, we have a job to do. And so many of us choose to incarnate at the same time together to do this work. Master was sent by Babaji. Swamiji comes when Master needs him to help. Many of us are tied to Swamiji. When Swamiji has a job to do, we come and help him do it. And this is what has been created. This is an uncommonly powerful force. So when enough people call sincerely enough, a mighty flow from the river of grace is deflected toward this planet. A new ray of light is drawn downward, and all who tune into it are uplifted as they never could be, were they to struggle merely on their own. Now, this call for a ray of grace is not like we call on Wednesday and Master incarnates on Sunday. This is a force that has been building for a long time. And according to the way Master tells the story in Autobiography of a Yogi, these are the disciples of Jesus and Jesus himself who launched a powerful movement towards self-realization. But over the many centuries, the true power of his teaching has been diluted by institutions and individuals who may be sincere in their intent, but are limited in their capacity to understand. So Jesus, feeling and hearing the call of his disciples who are losing their way because of the aberration that set into his teaching, that's a call that's being heard. There's a call coming from the whole planet of those who are awakening to the light, but don't know how to find their way in the confusion of Kali Yuga. There are the disciples of Master and of this whole line of teaching who have committed themselves to serve the Guru's work. As disciples, you have to serve the Guru, which means you have to serve his work, who've been coming to this planet in increasing numbers over the course of many generations to help prepare the way for the coming of Dwapara Yuga. And so all of these voices have been building, and then Jesus responds and talks to Babaji, and they start sending this line of gurus, and Lahiri begins to initiate, and all of those disciples are calling, you see, and then this huge ray of grace descends, culminating, and Master is the last in that line of teachers, culminating in Master coming to Sri Yukteswar, to America, to Mount Washington, calling Swami and all the rest of those disciples to make this transition from Kali Yuga into Dwapara, and in the process to receive the grace of God and ourselves become closer to God. God bless you.